Story 1. When I was 9, the treehouse appeared in our backyard overnight. That might sound impossible, but I swear it wasn't there the day before. One evening, it was just the old sycamore tree with its gnarled branches stretching toward the sky. The next morning, there it was, a perfectly constructed treehouse, perched among the limbs as if it had grown there. My parents assumed it was a neighbor's practical joke, but I couldn't stop staring at it. The wood looked ancient, weathered, gray, like driftwood, but it smelled freshly cut. It had a small window and a crooked door, its edges lined with intricate carvings of swirling shapes that seemed to shift if you stared too long. I felt drawn to it, pulled, even. But my dad's stern warning kept me at bay. "Don't go up there," he'd said. "It's not safe." For weeks I obeyed, but the treehouse didn't obey the rules of the world around it. At night, I'd see faint flickers of light from the window, like a candle was burning inside. Sometimes I'd hear whispers carried on the wind, too soft to make out, but impossible to ignore. My parents brushed it off as a trick of the imagination, but I wasn't so sure. Then, one day, the whispering stopped. The silence was even worse, like the air was holding its breath. That's when I decided I couldn't resist any longer. I waited until my parents were out, grabbed a flashlight, and climbed the rope ladder. The moment my hands touched the rope, I felt a strange warmth. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was unnerving. As I ascended, the air grew cooler, as though I were climbing into another world. When I reached the top and opened the door, the flashlight flickered and died. Inside, the treehouse was far larger than it had any right to be. The walls stretched back into impossible shadows, filled with shelves of books, jars of strange liquids, and objects that defied description. A single window looked out onto not my backyard. Instead, it revealed a dense forest, bathed in twilight, the trees swaying without any wind. I was about to turn and leave when I saw her. A girl, about my age, was sitting in the corner. Her hair was long and dark, her dress tattered and gray. She looked up at me with wide eyes, her face pale and streaked with dirt. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice trembling. "Who are you?" I asked, backing toward the door. She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed at one of the jars on the shelf. Inside was something dark, swirling like ink in water. The sight of it made my stomach twist. "They're coming," she whispered. Before I could ask what she meant, the door slammed shut behind me. The temperature plummeted, and the walls began to creak. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching and twisting until they took on vaguely human shapes. The girl screamed, and the sound made my blood run cold. "Take it," she yelled, pointing at the jar. "You have to take it." My instincts told me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows were closing in, their forms solidifying into grotesque figures with hollow eyes. I lunged for the jar, grabbing it just as one of the figures reached for me. The moment my fingers closed around the glass, the treehouse erupted in light. The shadows recoiled, their forms dissolving into wisps of smoke. The girl grabbed my hand, her grip icy cold, and pulled me toward the window. "Jump," she commanded. "Are you crazy?" I shouted, clutching the jar. "It's the only way." The figures were reforming, their hollow eyes glowing with malevolence. I didn't have a choice. Holding the jar tightly, I leapt through the window. I landed in my backyard with a jolt, the jar still intact in my arms. When I looked up, the treehouse was gone. The sycamore stood alone, its branches bare against the night sky. My flashlight lay in the grass beside me, its beam steady and bright. I never saw the girl again. But the jar. I couldn't bring myself to open it. I buried it beneath the sycamore, hoping that whatever was inside would stay there. Years later, when I visited the house as an adult, the tree was gone, cut down by the new owners. But the whispers, they were still there, faint and fleeting, carried on the wind. Story 2. I never thought I'd see the treehouse again. Not after what happened that night 10 years ago, but here I was, staring up at it, its crooked silhouette framed by the pale glow of the full moon. The wooden boards were warped, blackened by years of weathering, and the rope ladder swayed gently, though there wasn't even a hint of wind. The treehouse had been a sanctuary once. My cousins and I had built it during one endless summer when we were kids, hammering nails into the massive oak tree that towered over my grandparents' farm. Back then, it had been a fortress, a spaceship, a pirate's ship. It was everything our imaginations could conjure. But that night turned it into something else, a prison, a nightmare. It was the last summer we'd spent together before everything fell apart. My cousin Danny had gone missing that night. We had searched the fields, the woods, the barn, even the nearby creek. The police came, the dogs came, but Danny was never found. The adults whispered that he must have run away, but we knew better. Danny never would have left without telling us. I'd kept the secret for 10 years. I never told anyone about the voice we'd heard in the treehouse that night, about the way Danny's face had gone pale as a sheet before he climbed up to investigate, about how he had screamed, now standing there in the shadow of that monstrous oak. I wasn't sure why I'd come back. Maybe it was guilt, maybe I wanted closure, or maybe it was the letter. It had arrived a week ago, a single sheet of paper folded neatly into an unmarked envelope. The handwriting was jagged, hurried. I know what happened to Danny. Meet me at the treehouse. The letter hadn't been signed, but the handwriting was eerily familiar. It looked just like Danny's. I took a deep breath and grabbed the rope ladder. The moment I touched it, I felt the rough fibers scrape against my palms, just like they had all those years ago. My stomach churned, and a wave of nausea hit me, but I forced myself to climb. The creaking of the old wood was deafening in the still night. When I reached the top, I hesitated. The door to the treehouse was slightly ajar, just enough to see the darkness within. I pushed it open slowly, and the scent of mildew and rot hit me like a physical force. The moonlight spilled inside, illuminating the cramped space. Everything was just as we'd left it. The dusty sleeping bags, the overturned board game, the childish drawings pinned to the walls. But something was different. The air felt heavy, oppressive. And then I saw it, carved into the wooden floorboards. Deep and jagged was a single word. Run. I froze. My heart thundered in my chest. The word hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. My fingers trembled as I traced the letters. The gouges were fresh. Whoever had written it had done so recently. Hello? I called out, my voice shaky. It echoed in the confined space, then died, swallowed by the silence. I turned to leave, but as I did, something caught my eye. A small folded piece of paper was tucked into the corner, almost hidden beneath one of the sleeping bags. I picked it up and unfolded it. The handwriting was the same as the letter, but this message was even shorter. Don't let it touch you. Before I could process the warning, I heard it. A soft, shuffling noise, like something dragging against wood. I whipped around, my pulse spiking. The treehouse was empty. Or at least, it looked empty. Who's there? I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. The shuffling stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a voice. Low, guttural, and faintly familiar. You came back. My blood turned to ice. The voice wasn't coming from the treehouse. It was coming from below, from the base of the tree. I scrambled to the window and looked down. At first, I saw nothing, just the moonlit clearing, the swaying grass, and the shadowy outline of the barn in the distance. Then I saw it. A figure standing at the base of the tree, staring up at me. Its features were indistinct, as if it were made of shadow itself. But its eyes burned like embers. Danny? I whispered, though I already knew the answer. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't my cousin. The figure tilted its head, as if amused. Then it spoke again, its voice dripping with malice. You shouldn't have come back. Panic surged through me. I turned to climb down. The rope ladder was gone. No, not gone. It had been pulled up, the frayed ends now dangling just out of reach. The shuffling noise started again, louder this time. It was inside the treehouse. I spun around, my back pressed against the wall. My eyes darted frantically, searching for the source. That's when I saw it. A dark, twisting shape unfurling from the shadows, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. The thing moved closer, its elongated limbs reaching out. My breath caught in my throat. The words from the note echoed in my mind. Don't let it touch you. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a rusted flashlight, and swung it wildly. The metal connected with the creature, and for a brief moment it recoiled, letting out an ear-splitting screech. I didn't waste time. I hurled myself out the window, grabbing onto one of the lower branches. The impact sent pain shooting up my arms, but I held on, scrambling down as fast as I could. When I hit the ground, I didn't look back. I ran. My legs pumped furiously. My lungs burned. But I didn't stop until I reached the barn. I threw myself inside and slammed the door shut, bolting it with trembling hands. The barn was pitch dark, but I didn't dare turn on a light. I pressed myself against the wall, straining to hear any sound over the pounding of my heart. For a moment, there was nothing. Then the voice came again, closer this time. You can't run. The barn door rattled violently, the old wood groaning under the force. My mind raced. I needed a weapon. Something, anything, to defend myself. My hands fumbled in the dark until they closed around a rusted pitchfork. The door burst open, and the thing slithered inside, its form shifting and expanding to fill the space. Its ember eyes locked onto mine, and I knew there was no escaping it. Desperation took over. I lunged forward, plunging the pitchfork into the creature's center. The thing let out a deafening roar, its body convulsing violently. For a moment, I thought I'd killed it, but then it began to laugh, a deep guttural sound that shook me to my core. You can't kill me, it hissed. I'm part of you now. Before I could react, the creature dissolved into a cloud of shadow, rushing toward me. I screamed as the darkness enveloped me, its icy tendrils seeping into my skin. Pain exploded through my body, and then nothing. When I woke up, I was lying at the base of the oak tree, the first rays of dawn filtering through the branches. The treehouse was gone, as if it had never been there. But deep in my chest, I felt it, a cold, heavy presence that hadn't been there before. And I knew I would never be alone again. Story 3. The wind howled as I stepped onto the rocky island, the jagged cliffs slicing against the backdrop of an angry sea. The lighthouse stood at the edge, its towering silhouette cutting through the mist like a sentinel of the damned. Its beam was dark now, extinguished decades ago, and the keeper's cottage beside it was a ruin of cracked stone and shattered glass. I didn't want to be here, but the letter had been clear. Come alone. Midnight. Bring the journal. The journal belonged to my father, a man whose obsession with the supernatural had consumed him until his mysterious disappearance 5 years ago. I hadn't opened it until last week, when curiosity outweighed grief. Its pages were filled with frantic scribbles, diagrams of symbols I didn't understand, and accounts of a place he called the beacon between worlds. The final entry had been a single line. It's at Blackstone Point. Blackstone Point, this island, the lighthouse. The clock struck midnight as I approached the base of the tower. I clutched the journal tightly, my fingers numb from the cold. The door was ajar, creaking on rusted hinges. It shouldn't have been. The Coast Guard had sealed it years ago. Hello? My voice was swallowed by the void. No answer. I stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decay. My flashlight illuminated a spiral staircase winding upward into darkness. The journal's pages seemed heavier in my hands, the words whispering unspoken warnings. As I climbed, I became acutely aware of the silence. No wind, no waves, just the rhythmic thud of my boots against the metal steps and the pounding of my heart. Halfway up, I found the first sign of something wrong. A smear of black ichor stained the wall, as if something had dragged itself upward. It shimmered unnaturally in the beam of my flashlight, like oil on water. My gut twisted, but I pressed on, the journal's weight pulling me forward. When I reached the top, I found the lantern room. Its glass panes were fogged with grime, and the great lens sat silent and cold. But the center of the room, that's where I froze. A figure stood there, back turned to me, hunched over something on the floor. It was wrapped in tattered, dark clothing that looked soaked through. Strands of seaweed tangled around its limbs. The stench of brine and rot was overwhelming. "Who's there?" I demanded, though my voice cracked. The figure moved, its head tilting, as if it had just noticed me. Slowly, it turned. Its face wasn't human. Its features were warped, twisted, as though something had tried to mold a man's visage from wet clay and failed. But its eyes, glowing, unearthly orbs, locked onto mine with an intensity that pinned me in place. "You brought it," it rasped, its voice like the scraping of stones. "Brought what?" I managed, my grip tightening on the journal. It pointed to the book, its elongated fingers glistening with the same black ichor. "The key. Open it." Every instinct screamed at me to run, to throw the journal into the sea, and never look back. But something deeper, a pull I couldn't explain, compelled me to obey. My hands trembled as I flipped to the last page. The blank sheet I'd seen before was now filled with intricate writing, words I couldn't comprehend, but that burned themselves into my mind. The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky, inhuman. "Read it aloud." "No," I said, clutching the journal to my chest. "Not until you tell me what's going on. Who are you? What happened to my father?" The thing's face twisted into a grotesque smile. "Your father opened the door. You will close it." "What door?" It didn't answer. Instead, it lunged, its clawed hands swiping for the journal. I stumbled back, narrowly avoiding its grasp. My flashlight clattered to the floor, plunging the room into dim, flickering light. Desperate, I ran for the stairs, the journal tucked under my arm. The thing's screeches followed me, bone-chilling sound that echoed down the spiral staircase. As I descended, the ichor spread, seeping from the walls and pooling on the steps. My boots slipped, and I barely caught myself on the railing. Behind me, the creature's glowing eyes appeared, growing closer. I hit the ground floor and burst through the door, stumbling into the night. The wind had returned, screaming across the island. But the lighthouse. It had changed. The once dark beam now blazed with an unnatural light, piercing the clouds and illuminating the churning sea. In the distance, shapes moved in the water, massive, hulking figures, their forms barely distinguishable from the waves. They were coming closer. "Read it," the creature screeched, now at the doorway. "Close the door." The journal's pages fluttered open in the wind, landing on the final entry. The words glowed faintly, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the beam of the lighthouse. My father's voice echoed in my mind, his desperate plea from the last tape he left me. Some doors should never be opened. I didn't understand the words on the page, but my voice moved on its own, speaking them aloud. The air around me vibrated, and the light from the lighthouse intensified, becoming blinding. The creature screamed, a sound of pure anguish. Its form dissolved into the ichor, which sank into the ground as if pulled by some unseen force. The figures in the water stopped, their massive shapes retreating back into the depths. The light dimmed, and then the beam extinguished entirely. Silence fell over the island. I stood there, the journal still in my hands, its pages now blank. The lighthouse loomed above me, silent once more. Whatever door my father had opened, I had closed it. But as I turned to leave, I saw something in the distance, a faint glow beneath the waves. And I knew this wasn't over.